Greetings friends, you are on the Ruslan Belov channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine as of October 2nd, 2025. A large number of very important events have taken place today, so let's get started. Yes, indeed, today has been an intense and eventful day. And we will begin, as has already become tradition, with the Zaporizhzhia sector of the front, where the Vostok Group, consisting of the 5th, 36th and 29th Armies, has once again improved its positions in the area of the Poltavka and Uspianovka fortified zones. Let's start with the Poltavka fortified area. Today there are reports that the Russian army has firmly established itself on the southeastern and eastern outskirts of the settlement of Poltavka. Yesterday, this information was confirmed by video footage published by the Ukrainian side. We already discussed this video. In those frames, we can observe artillery strikes against Russian units and soldiers attempting to secure positions in this part of the settlement. Today, the zone of control has expanded both to the south and to the north. All forest lines around Poltavka are now under the control of the Russian armies. Everything is prepared for Russian units to begin entering the city itself. The only problem is that Poltavka lies, so to speak, on the western bank of the Yanchel River, which means that advancing further will be difficult, at least in the initial stage, until the river can be crossed and positions consolidated. After that, of course, everything will proceed more smoothly and quickly. Russian units of the 36th Army are also advancing right up to the settlement of Uspianovka and the Uspianovka fortified area. Today, Ukrainian sources published footage of objective control showing FPV drone strikes against Russian assault troops on motorcycles who were attempting to rush in from the direction of Nova Ivanivka toward the tree lines, trying to secure positions as close as possible to the settlement of Novo Vasilivka, a small village located on the Russian side of the Yanchel River. At the moment, the distance between Russian forward positions and the Ukrainian armed forces positions is already less than 2 kilometers. This means that in the near future, Russian units are likely to finish the battles for the farms located between Novo Vasilivka and Novo Hrihorivka, as well as complete the fighting for Novo Hrihorivka itself. After that, Russian units will gradually move toward the Uspianovka fortified zone. Also today, neutral cartographers reported that the Russian army has finished clearing the settlement of Verbov. Well, we will wait for additional confirmation on this matter, and possibly in the near future, Russian units will begin gradually moving toward the next settlement, named Vishnev. We can see that the Ukrainian side is unable to stabilize the front line in this sector. Let me remind you that if the Uspianovka and Poltavka fortified zones are lost, it seems there will simply be nothing left for the armed forces of Ukraine to defend here. The Russian army will then be able to move further west unhindered, first encircling Huliai-Pol from the north, then Orikhiv, and eventually, perhaps as early as the spring of 2026, Aprocha, the eastern outskirts of the city of Zaporizhzhia itself. Now we move to the Pavlivka sector of the front, where the Russian army is gradually preparing a bridgehead ahead of combat operations. Today, footage of objective control was released, showing Russian aviation striking tree lines, positions, and logistical routes around the settlement of Novopavlivka. The most important episode captured is the moment when a Russian airstrike destroys the only remaining bridge under Ukrainian control, which had been used to supply the Ukrainian garrison inside Novopavlivka. This refers to this particular bridge. Let me remind you that several weeks ago, the Russian army began storming the settlement of Ivanivka. At first, reports were coming in quite dynamically, with publications about advances. Then, for about a week, there was silence, no information at all from this sector. Possibly the offensive stalled, possibly it is continuing, and soon there will be confirmation of the settlement being cleared. In any case, the most important fact is that Russian units, according to the latest data, are present inside the village. This tells us that the road running from Havrilivka toward Novopavlivka is already either under fire control or physically cut. That is one of the two supply routes, and it is already under at least indirect Russian control. Today there is also information about the destruction of the bridge on the T0428 route, leading from Novopavlivka toward Mezhova. Of course, this will not completely stop Ukrainian logistics, but it will complicate them. So we see that Novopavlivka is being blockaded from all sides and by all possible means. This indicates that in the near future, the offensive here can only gain momentum. Next, we move to the Pokrovsk sector of the front, from where extremely important news is coming out of the breakthrough zone. The situation here continues to develop in the most unpredictable and unclear ways. We are witnessing what could be described as a sort of swing. That is the term I chose today to describe the situation I am currently observing. Let us begin with the adjustments. To start, today pro-Ukrainian cartographers, using the trendy phrase, rolled out a large update for this direction. According to it, a large part of the so-called Western ear, the breakthrough zone here, is often referred to as rabbit ears, because at the beginning the shape of the advance resembled rabbit ears. Even a rabbit overall has been fully and finally cleared. Specifically, Ukrainian sources report that the left or western rabbit ear was completely cleared along the line from the settlement of Zoloty Kolodets southward toward Novoshakov. Novoshakov itself was also cleared by Ukrainian units. Based on these reports from pro-Ukrainian cartographers, neutral cartographers, we make the corresponding adjustments. This is how the map looked just yesterday. All these territories were considered disputed, shrouded in the fog of war, as areas where Russian units might still be present, or where fighting might still be ongoing. Today, Ukrainian sources are clarifying the situation along the front line. But again, let me emphasize, the adjustments made in this sector are mostly done on the basis of testimonies from, let's say, reliable sources and independent experts. That is why we often mark them as grey zones, or sometimes recolor them in the opposite direction if there was no direct evidence. When it comes to the Russian side, however, corrections are made on the basis of video materials. And the most important footage today comes from an area slightly northeast of the settlement of Zoloty Kolodets. In this video, we can see Ukrainian units dropping explosive devices on Russian armed forces positions. This episode and this location were geolocated. At this exact point, a Ukrainian FPV drone dropped explosives, which confirms the presence of Russian units along this tree line. It is difficult to say how deeply Russian units are entrenched there. It's possible that the entire tree line is under Russian control. However, taking into account Ukrainian source corrections, pro-Russian reports, and earlier progress in the area of Kucherev Yar, we mark the map from Kucherev Yar toward Vesele and the northeastern part of Zoloty Kolodets. This so-called Eastern Rabbit Ear is under firm and clear control of Russian units. Returning to the areas recolored according to Ukrainian sources, the main discussion now revolves around the settlement of Dorozhny. The Ukrainian side attempted a counterstrike here, and for the first time in a while, we actually saw Bradleys in action. This is one of the rare episodes in 2025 when Ukraine deployed 2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles in combat. They bypassed Dorozhny along the road, moved in from the flanks toward the east and the supply line, and apparently dismounted troops there. But these expensive Bradley vehicles were simply left abandoned in the open with no chance of evacuation. In principle, this was probably the correct choice, because just moments later, both Bradleys were destroyed by Russian FPV drones and their operators. Looking at the map again, we can trace the Bradleys' movement. They came from the direction of Belitske, followed this road, without entering Dorozhny itself, went north, bypassed Dorozhny along this route, then descended south again and moved east. At this point, the landing occurred, most likely with the objective of seizing this tree line or some strong points not marked on the map in this area. The goal of the strike was clear, to block Dorozhny from the east and cut off supplies, especially with the use of robotic systems, since now only drones and robots are supplying Dorozhny. The apparent task was to encircle, isolate, and eventually storm or clear the settlement. At this stage, the Bradleys were destroyed, the troops dismounted at this spot, and what happened to them is unclear. In the available footage, we see no confirmation of strikes against the Ukrainian assault infantry, which suggests they hid well in the forested area. In any case, the battle for this settlement has begun. The Ukrainian side is trying to push out Russian units and straighten the front line to the west. At the same time, the Russian side is attacking eastward towards Shakov, the Shakov pocket, Boykovka, Pankivka, Vladimirovka, and Novotoretske. Thus, we see this back-and-forth dynamic, these swings. It is not a direct head-on battle. The Russian army is trying to maintain distance by pulling back, maneuvering and expanding control in areas where, just a week ago, Ukrainian units were conducting attacks or counterattacks. Now, however, the situation is reversed. Ukrainian units are advancing actively from west to east, attempting to push Russian forces off these lines. And as soon as Ukrainian forces launch such maneuvers, Russian units resume movement towards Shakov and surrounding settlements. This constant swing is now becoming systemic. A defined tactic can already be observed on both sides. At this stage, everything comes down to resources, manpower, and, of course, the ability of commanders to maneuver, adapt, and exploit conditions in order to develop the situation further. Now we move to the Siversk-Lyman direction. Here, today, there are no changes. Russian units have apparently taken a brief pause, although combat is of course ongoing. Reports indicate that the assault on Dronivka has begun. Russian troops are approaching Dronivka through a children's camp located along the Siversky Donets River and are now reaching the northern part of the settlement. Fighting also continues in Yampil, gradually shifting toward the central areas. The Ukrainian side continues to move, in reinforcements through Lyman, Ozern, and Zakitne. Full fire control has been established over the main routes. That is the situation here. On the Kupiansk direction, no changes either. No new reports have come in. Now we turn to France. Today, for the first time, perhaps not only since the start of the special military operation, but possibly in the history of relations between the Russian Federation and European countries, France has created a legal precedent. In this footage, we see French special forces boarding an oil tanker bound for India that had departed from St. Petersburg. The boarding party carried out the seizure of the tanker. The French claim that this tanker belongs to Russia's shadow fleet, which bypasses sanctions to trade oil, thus generating revenue that, according to the West, is used to finance the special military operation. Immediately after the operation, the French fell silent and awaited Russia's reaction. They were so alarmed that even the chief of the French General Staff declared that from now on the French must be prepared for high-intensity combat operations with the Russian Federation. Indeed, this was a risky move by France. However, so far, there has been no response from the Russian Federation. Later in the evening, Macron announced that France now can and should detain all Shadow Fleet ships. Macron came up with an interesting scheme. Russian tankers sailing to India cannot be arrested outright since they are not breaking any laws. But under certain legal grounds and technicalities, France can detain them for 10 to 20 days, pending clarification. Macron is betting that this 10 to 20-day delay will be enough to disrupt Russia's oil logistics with India and damage its oil trade system overall. We will have to watch how this situation unfolds, but overall, this is a very unpleasant legal precedent that could lead to unpredictable consequences for the European Union, the Russian Federation, and, of course, Ukraine. The reason the French stopped the tanker is tied to accusations from Zelensky, who claimed, according to Ukrainian intelligence, that Russia uses these tankers to launch drones against Ukraine, and not only Ukraine, but even European Union territory. All the drone incidents over NATO bases in Europe and so forth served as a legal pretext for France to justify inspections of vessels to check whether drones are on board. Naturally, this justification will now be used repeatedly. And that is all, dear friends. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel, leave your likes, and all the best to you.